Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock, and I'm calling the June 4th, 2025 meeting of the Environmental and Natural Resources Advisory Committee to order, please. We have a quorum, already counted. Happy June, everybody. So as people take their seats, could we have roll call, and could all of our guests and staff identify themselves for the recording, please?
Melissa Lammers, Jessica Gao, Wendy Anderson,
Here.
Donna Brosmer, Tom Burbank, Bob Fitzsimmons, John Hoblick, Bliss Jameson, John Geronimo, Bill Lights, Tyler Momberg, Sarah Lee Morrissey, Jack Surratt, Michelle Whittick. Others present, Julie McChrystal, Environmental Management.
Keith Abramson, Environmental Management.
Samantha West, Environmental Management.
Clay Irvin, Director of Growth and Resource Management.
Thank you. That's everyone.
We have a few online as
Thank you.
well. It looks like Jessica is online and Paolo Soria.
Oh, great. So I forget, after we do minutes or now we would entertain a motion to allow Jessica Gao to participate and vote remotely. If someone
So moved.
Moved by Wendy Anderson, seconded by Bill Lights. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. And Ben Bartlett's just walked in for the record. So Jessica Gao, motion carries. Jessica's allowed to participate and vote remotely. Thank you very much. Next, did everyone have an opportunity to review the minutes from our May 7th meeting? I enjoyed them. Do we have a motion for approval of the minutes? Motion made by Sarah Lee. Do we have a second? Seconded by John Geronimo. Sorry. Any discussion of the minutes or comments to the minutes? Okay, all those in favor of approving the minutes from the May 7th meeting, say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The May 7th minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda is what to do about July. The regularly scheduled meeting falls on Wednesday, July 2nd. And rather than necessarily change that, by a show of hands, could we see how many people would intend to keep that meeting if we kept that date? Six. Okay, Jessica, would you make that meeting?
I could, yes.
Oh, thank you very much. So that I counted 7. So that would not be a quorum. Pardon? Someone else count differently? Okay, if we don't anticipate having a quorum on that date, then we probably should change the date, which will cause some shuffling of things and cause us to meet more quickly for August. But pardon? For August? No. We haven't decided on an alternate date. So asking staff, it would need to be a Wednesday still? For the room use and all that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd have to make sure availability for the room for sure.
So that would be 2 + 7 is 9, if I can do math. So the next closest date in the month of July would be July 9th. Everybody take a moment, please, and look at your calendars if you have them. and I have a conflict that day. Everybody else good? They really won't be here. Another choice potentially would be to meet sooner. Is that permitted to meet in the end of June? Rather than the beginning of July?
I guess it depends on what we get through today and what you expect staff to be ready for a
Good point.
meeting.
So if we did June, that would be the 25th, but that's 3 weeks. Is there any appetite for that? Staff, is that heartburn for you? Okay.
So June 25th is our 2025 CRS audit. You all know about the CRS program. So that means that I would not be here to discuss anything about flood hazard management because I need to be available for our CRS auditor if they have any questions about all the documents we are submitting to them. So that would be the conflict on my end. So, but if we wait and depending on how we go today, right? If we want to look at ordinance language for flood hazard management in August, and then we would do wetlands, continue with wetlands in 3 weeks, can do that as well.
So Samantha, who had a birthday yesterday, is suggesting that we look at this, we revisit this at the end of the meeting, right? Is that okay? Pending how much we get through. All right, so we will come back to the July meeting date at the end of this meeting. And so without further ado, we can move on to old business, flood hazard management, proposed ordinance changes, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, let's get started. So this is the PowerPoint that you received last week. Well, first, we're just going to go through what we approved last time so everybody, jogs their memory and what we did. We approved the following modifications as you see on the screen. So that is, I'm currently working with the Florida Department of Emergency Management to draft that ordinance language for you all to look at. The modification that was denied at that meeting was to add compensatory storage criteria to the land development code with the following 2 items below that. And this was the language that came out of the new Smyrna Beach Flood Hazard Management Code. And I didn't know if there wanted to be any discussion about that denial, or if Ben wanted to provide some information about that as well.
Real quick, I just, I wasn't at the last meeting, but New Smyrna, as y'all know, has basically increased the amount of compensating storage by 50% what's required in their code. I don't know if that's the correct answer. What I will say, protecting the floodplain is one of the most important things you can do to protect, I'm getting a head nod from Dr. Anderson on that, so I'm going to appreciate that. But protecting the floodplain is one of the most important things that can be done to ensure that new development doesn't cause flooding or impacts off-site. And I don't know if 50% is the answer, but I think some factor of safety when it comes to compensating storage for floodplain impacts is a good idea. Also, when you consider the fact that the floodplain is based on a 1% event or the 100-year event, and we've, in the last few years, have received storm events that are significantly greater than that amount of rain, any amount of additional compensating storage or factor of safety that can be done would be beneficial in those types of events if the assumption is that we're going to see more of them. How we get to that number, I'm not sure. If it's maybe an elevation, additional foot of compensating storage, I'm just throwing a number out there, but or 50% or 25% or whatever that number is, I think some look at that would be warranted and would probably be helpful moving forward.
So this, my own vote on this troubled me because I was troubled because I think I asked the question, how did we get to 50%? And no one could provide an answer. But the theoretical of it, well, not the theoretical, the need to protect the floodplain is obvious. Can you give us some guidance
I
at all
think-
on this?
I think the 50% number, and Samantha, correct me if I'm wrong, there is some credits that you get from the CRS program where you get to a certain number, and my understanding is that might be why they chose that particular number.
The CRS credit is for the 1.5 to 1 for compensating storage for the properties. That's what gets you the additional CRS credit. The 50% of the total flood storage volume, I'm not aware if that gets you an additional CRS points or not, or if that is just what was in New Smyrna Beach's code.
And one more question. At this time, do we have absolutely no requirement for compensatory storage? 1-to-1. Okay, thank you.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but in our county code, we adhere to it because it's a federal requirement to be to make sure
Yeah.
that we're applicable to the federal standard. But I don't believe our code actually officially requires any compensating storage whatsoever.
Well, that's not great.
But I mean, we in practice, because we have to adhere to the requirements associated with the floodplain, with our floodplain rules, we do it that way. But I think we need something in the code that requires something.
And we do have that table. I'm reminded of what I forgot. We do have that table showing the different CRS ratings for the communities. Sarah Lee.
Sorry, I just shut that off. I remember us having this conversation because I asked a specific question in that regard. And generally, all the local governments are relying on the water management district to impose that 1-to-1. And I think that is problematic, that we're relying on another agency. But I had a question, and I'm not sure if you have, I remember going to the New Smyrna Beach community meeting when they first started their stormwater study. And the discussion at that time, which is well over a year ago, was that 1.5%, 1.5 to 1 requirement was a relatively new requirement, and they had not yet had any existing development that had complied. So there was no ability to comment, how do you see that changing, blah, blah, blah. Do you know, has anyone gone through the process and started their development with that requirement? Do we know anything about how that has impacted actual development? And I realize it's New Smyrna Beach, it's not the county, but.
We've been coordinating with Stephanie Dosser over there, and the answer is haven't got a final answer on it yet. It's, again, as Ben said, a factor of safety. They came up with a 50% they feel is the appropriate magnitude. So I can just say anecdotally that if you're looking at a large tract of land that you're doing greenfield development, that will be a little bit easier to work around than if you're dealing with a infill parcel or, a vested lot for a single family home. If we tried to implement a 1.5 to 1 on some of the lots within Daytona Park Estates, that we'd be taking those parcels, which may not be a bad idea. But the simple fact is that I think it's going to be a situation that whatever we wind up with, 1-to-1, 1.25 to 1, et cetera, we're going to have those situations where there will be a need for some sort of site-specific evaluation and determination if there's approval of a variance or alteration based on appropriate engineering practices.
Lynn Tyler.
So I think first of all, the state, the water management district, I don't think requires floodplain compensation. That's a completely municipal thing. It's either county or city. So there's nothing to rely on there for them, right? Ben?
Yeah, that's actually my understanding. The water management district will note that you're in the floodplain, but in practice, it's typically the local municipalities that require it to be in compliance with their floodplain.
And I think we have done several projects, Zevco and in the city of New Smyrna Beach at the 1.5 to 1. I think it's been for a while. So I don't know. Correct me.
Did everyone hear that? That Michelle confirmed what Bill said, Shell Point development in New Smyrna is 1.5 to 1. Tyler.
So yeah, I was just going to confirm what Bill was saying. St. John's or the other water management districts typically don't deal with our floodplain impact permitting for the 100-year. St. John's does deal with 10-year floodplain. If you have stuff that is known and documented to flood during a 10-year event, that's the only thing that they get involved with. So like DOT is responsible for dealing with their 100-year impacts internally and checking themselves. Local agencies are responsible for checking that their applicants don't have impacts. If you're making a modification that would impact the floodplain, you're likely making a modification that should also go through a map revision process of some kind, whether it's a letter of map revision or an MT1 or an MT2 process with FEMA. And so that's where FEMA will come in for permitting some of our floodplain impact changes there. On a single family lot, that's not something that we typically, it's a letter of map revision at most for the fill of the house.
Clay.
Keep it short and simple. I guess what it's clarifying is that Volusia County needs to have something in our code that identifies what we have as far as mandating compensatory storage. That way we don't, we avoid the potential of, oh, DEP, St. John's, all these other acronyms may be requiring it.
Sarah Lee.
I'm not going to point fingers, but I know of a jurisdiction that is not insisting on the compensating storage of all applicants. Does this requirement have to be a minimum standard?
My suggestion is that it should be, because I think half the county's in the floodplain, more than half of the county's in the floodplain. And so, and those floodplains extend beyond jurisdictional boundaries sometimes. So that would be my suggestion. Yes.
So just to restate what Clay already restated, we're hearing clearly this time around that responsibly we should have something both in ordinance and something in Chapter 50, which we're not working on just yet, but we can note that. I can't make motions.
I have a question, Melissa, if I can.
Yes, Jessica.
Just on that point, I think last time part of the discussion is if this is a minimum standard countywide. There was a comment made that I think in the county, the preference is to see the comp storage on site. But in applying comp storage regulations in other jurisdictions, we have regional comp storage ponds or off-site compensatory storage. I'm just wondering if it's contemplated that that would be permitted.
I have a question to that. But go ahead, Clay.
I was just going to say, again, I apologize for not being at the last meeting, but I would say at a minimum it needs to be in the same basin.
That was kind of my clarification, because if the goal is to
Right.
not keep flooding people and flooding our neighbors, then
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be on site. It just has to be in the same flood bay.
And that's how they apply it now in those jurisdictions. So that makes sense.
Tyler. Thank you, Jessica.
So I think getting into some of rubber meets the road challenges that I'm running into in my mind, there's a lot of ways that we can, under the FEMA guidance, deal with floodplain mitigation if we have impacts. Obviously, if you just have a bowl and you impact it, you fill, you have cup for cup. But if you're on something that has a positive outfall and you fill in the floodplain, you may not create an adverse impact to somebody else. You may be able to go downstream and take a pipe and make it a bigger pipe or a box culvert or something else. And these are all things that are not bad tools for us to have in the toolbox. If misapplied, any tool can be used wrong by engineers. But so I didn't like the idea of 50% more flood volume because it starts getting into an erosion of those other techniques and tools that can be better for preventing community flooding. Like the whole Lee Vista area of East Orlando, they dug drainage canals and dewatered a lot of that area so that they would have positive outfall to the Conallahatchee. And it's how that whole area was able to build out. A lot of Florida is built that way. And it's not just cup for cup that if we fill here, we dig here. It's sometimes more complex. I would suggest that if we're looking to have a rule, that we try to have something that's relatively generic and that maybe references the FEMA standards, because there's entire manuals on this process and they're extremely detailed. Just would be my suggestion as a kind of starting point rather than starting with a direct volume cup method.
Are those FEMA directives or analyses, are those specific to the kind of situations we confront here in Florida where we're so darn wet?
Yeah, absolutely.
One statement I would make to that is Tyler's correct. However, I think part of the problem New Smyrna's faced, and it may explain part of their reasoning behind their rule, but it's also something that we've observed. Just because you have a positive outfall 99% of the time doesn't mean it's always a positive outfall when a storm comes through and you have a tidal situation. And so, if you're going to do something like that, you got to make sure that your tailwater conditions and all those things, other things we've talked about, are correct. And so when that does occur, if the water can't flow out, all those things that you did to mitigate for that impact in the floodplain might not work.
Whereas leaving it can work. Bliss.
Well, then I have to ask, is this in preparation for, in consideration for a, 500-year flood or 1,000-year flood? And what is it we really make it for?
Well, that's a great question. And that's really kind of comes down to I used this analogy the other day, talking amongst elected officials about flooding and, trying to get them to understand the magnitude of the storm events that we recently had. And so, can we build a building for an F5 tornado that's 300 miles an hour and withstand? Yeah, we could. It's going to cost a ton of money. Does anybody actually do it? No, maybe in a select few certain circumstances. So, some of those storms that we received are, in terms of flooding, might be on par with that kind of, comparison to that big of a wind event. So should we design to some of those 1,000-year storm events? That's really a policy decision at a certain point, because you start getting into the cost benefit analysis of it, just like, with the additional 50% compensating storage, you're going to start eating into property. I'm kind of playing both sides of the fence here on this discussion, but, that's where I'm hesitant to say 1.5 to 1 is the answer. It's hard to create a hard and fast rule. I think some level of factor of safety is a good idea. What we get there, and I would defer to, some of the folks, probably a little more experienced in designing these types of systems on the private side or in general, on what is a good way to do it, kind of along the lines of what Tyler talked about. I just think we need to be careful, when we're trying to make a rule to make sure that it does work in as many situations as possible, provides that factor of safety.
I guess I don't understand why we're coming back to something we already voted on. I mean, we make votes and move on and make votes and move on. I don't know if we've ever gone back to something that we've voted on.
I just wanted to make sure that you had all of the information and that you knew what type of impact that your vote means.
We also didn't have Ben here last time for any kind of an expert answer from staff, and that I actually feel like my decision was made under duress to be very personal about it, because I wanted information and I couldn't get the information that I wanted. And I think in a way we're still in that position. When we dealt with stormwater, we created a safety factor for storage, and we accepted something that was admittedly somewhat arbitrary. And we decided, well, we have to see how this works, recognizing that we had to do something, not knowing if it's enough. And it seems to me this is a similar situation where we need to do something. So we have to figure out what, as Ben just said, what that is. Ben, then Wendy.
I just want to say, at a minimum, we need something, because right now there's technically not even the 1-to-1 requirement officially in the code. So even if that's the decision, we just need to put something, and I would argue that it needs to probably be a minimum it needs to be a Chapter 50 requirement. So it applies throughout.
Wendy.
Right. I was just going to say the same thing. Last time, it seemed like we voted based on the fact that there was no scientific basis for the 1.5. That was an arbitrary number. And then, we want to be science-based, but I totally agree. I appreciate that Ben is here today and both Ben and Samantha are asking us to reconsider this. I think that's why we're having the conversation again, because I think it would be perhaps irresponsible of us to move forward without addressing this, given that there is nothing in the code about this. I certainly hear Tyler's point about there being other tools in the toolbox. Maybe this isn't the only tool, but we need to have some sort of language that does account for how we're going to manage that displaced floodwater. And I voted in opposition to this last time, so I don't think I can make a motion to bring it back to the table. I think the no's were Melissa, Sarah, and me, so I can't do it, but I would be happy to have an opportunity to vote again.
And Melissa, I have a
But-
question just in the queue.
Okay. But, and I did look at the minutes, but now I'm forgetting. Wasn't the motion to do the 1.5 to 1? So, and I understand what your point is about reconsidering that motion. Could not anyone just make a motion to do a 1-to-1 so that there's at least something in the code? Cannot just anybody do that one motion? Because that's a new motion. That's not, right?
Yeah, that should be completely okay.
Okay.
Okay, and just because, so we have Jessica, Bob, Jack.
Yeah, mine was similar to what Sarah Lee just said. My recollection is at least in my part, the move away from this 50% restriction and the 1-to-5 is that we said we did want to do the avoidance and minimization and mitigation. And I thought in that discussion, we said you avoid to the extent possible, and then you mitigate at least for that 1-for-1. But if we need to clarify that 1-for-1 standard, I'm all for that.
Bob. Thank you, Bob. Jack.
Yeah, I wanted to ask another question. If we were to deal with this as it is with the 50%. Could we add to that some sort of catch, like unless other engineering methods would compensate in a similar fashion? In other words, could we add Tyler's thoughts to this in particular in order for an evaluation to be made? In other words, the burden would be on the engineer to say, well, wait a minute, we're doing something here that would make a difference. And that way we would have a higher standard in place. But in fact, if it can be engineered in a better way or in a different way, then the developer would have that option. And so I'm wondering if that's an opportunity, or am I just kissing my sister?
I had the same, just kiss.
I'm hoping that's in the minutes.
Okay. I wondered that too, because I'm sure Tyler and his operation is extremely scrupulous and would make sure that the tailwater projections, weren't going to be impeded, but we can't count on that for everyone. So engineer.
You could make an exception for a situation where it's an open basin versus a closed basin, like Tyler suggested, where you basically adhere to the FEMA standards for an open basin, and for a closed basin, you could do some factor of safety. Clay's got some.
And also, we're drilling in right now on that specific standard. If you look at section 72-748, variances and appeals, this is the section that gives all the engineers and all the developers and everybody else the ability to go through a variance process to our floodplain management requirements. And these are the factors that would be identified in making those applications. So we do already have on the books the ability that if someone doesn't want to comply with our floodplain management requirements, they have the opportunity to appeal and seek a variance.
Tyler.
So Jack, I think there is a way to kind of roll them together. I would probably phrase it a little bit differently. If we go to how Florida Building Code deals with existing structures versus new structures, and when you have to make the upgrade, they start with a like for like on replacement of structural members, things of that. You get to a certain threshold of value, which right now is 50% of the structural value. And then you have to have an engineering analysis of the structure for your vertical, horizontal loading conditions, yada, yada, yada. We could basically say the same thing, that you can meet the compensatory storage of 1-for-1 that will be presumed to have mitigated for your floodplain impact, or you can prepare basically a special basin engineering flood study that demonstrates how other mitigation actions would meet that criteria. Dealing with tailwater, I have a project right now for the county that one of the things that we're going to be discussing, Ben, is how to set the tailwater on Spruce Creek, where Pioneer Trail crosses Spruce Creek. There's not really high watermark stains that are reliable indicators of where it gets following a hurricane. And do we use something like Milton, where it's more than a 100-year event as our tailwater, or do we try to estimate 100-year? Even with the best efforts at establishing these things, like a tailwater condition, we're either using another engineering model that we may or may not have responsibility for the creation of, and we may not know what assumptions were made in its creation, or we're using our best physical indicators. So I would say have a buffer, take the 100-year floodplain elevation and make us add a foot to it or something, and show that if we're using a discharge improvement method to mitigate our impacts, that we have some reliability on it, either additional water or additional tailwater height, or there are very easy ways to just adjust our models and test a couple different conditions and show, yeah, it's better in this one and in this one, therefore it's probably going to reliably work. It's when it shows better in one model and not in 3 that I get uncomfortable to move forward with the design, whether I can get the permit or not. And I run it 30 different other ways to make sure that I'm not going to have a flooding call.
You've done this before. How would you make a motion like that?
I got to think on that one for a minute.
Wendy?
And are we talking about making a change to 72 or 50? Because I would hope that we could go, as Ben suggested, for a change at minimum standards in chapter 50 for everybody.
I have no idea on that because otherwise we said we were going to go, I think for wetlands, we were going to do all the chapter 72 changes and then go back and retrofit chapter 50. But I mean,
That is the
Guidance.
plan for wetlands. However, there are no minimum standards for flood hazard management within chapter 50 right now. Correct.
well, Clay,
In regards to trying to come up with the all exacting ability to avoid having to do whatever we decide is appropriate compensatory storage, there is the authority in the land development code that allows for us to have, and I'll read through it. The DRC shall hear and decide appeals when there's a determination, the floodplain administrator or anyone, that it's appropriate. The DRC shall base its decision on technical justification submitted by the applicants, and the consideration shall be based on the standards contained in the land development regulations. So there's a really broad-based situation, because if we start trying to plan it for what Tyler's talking about, in 3 months, he's going to have a new project where we're going to have to come up with even more different standards. So I would just say leaving it at a point where that engineer submits to our engineers and they have a battle of the engineers in front of the development review committee.
Chris, Tyler, Jack?
Because we're on this, so we'll stay there and I'll ask my question later.
So I was gonna say, I think I want to make a motion that we have Ben and Clay work on some draft language for this, for chapter 50. Well, and I'm not trying to kick the can on this, but we're getting very far into something that is detailed, and we're kind of getting to where I'm having trouble following it, and I feel like I'm one of the experts in the room on this, and if I'm getting lost, I can't imagine how you guys are keeping up at all, because this is complicated. It sounds to me like we need a flood management section in chapter 50, that it needs to be required that the municipalities have a flood management section, and that we need to define some goals of what would be in that section, that maybe we can get some draft language for potentially the August meeting, if we don't have a July meeting. So I would say, let's move that we ask staff to prepare at least an outline of a flood management section for chapter 50 that would include mitigation standards. So one of them could be compensatory storage, one of them could be engineering modeling. I do not like the engineer battle it out in front of DRC. There are a lot of clients who will only hire engineers that are unscrupulous. All we're doing is we're inviting more dishonesty into our process when we don't codify an honest process for it, because I'm not going to come in giving you everything that I think is perfectly fair if my client's going to fire me for that. I'm going to come in trying to hold back as many cards as I can. Even me, I find myself not liking to work for those clients, but it's part of our industry. So I do not like it when we create situations that puts the integrity of the engineer as the only thing keeping the public protected, because not every engineer has perfect integrity. So I do think we need a process for what would be acceptable engineering studies for our open basin areas. I think that maybe some recommended, safety buffers, whether it's on the tailwater or on how we look at the rainfall routing on it or something, could be there. I think New Smyrna, the 1.5 to 1, might make more sense than in some of the basins in West Volusia. I'm hesitant to apply something that works in one part of the county but not in other parts of the county as just a county-wide standard, which is why my motion is asking them to make something a little more generic that has kind of the couple of processes that could be followed. Then if a developer doesn't want to follow it and they want to get a waiver, that's when they're at DRC and we do the engineer to engineer battle, and Tad and I can put on boxing gloves. I don't know. Gets too slimy.
Jack,
If that's the motion, I guess I second it. I'm not sure.
That is my really rough motion.
Yeah, but
Sorry to the minute keepers.
the,
can you
The-
read that back, Chelsea?
but one thing relative to that and as a discussion base, I still believe it might be better to be at a higher standard, similar to what New Smyrna did, even if it's arbitrary, to be at a higher standard and let some of these things fall out, whether it be in the appeals process or what it might be, versus really just trying to get it on the books similar to other agencies. So I like the fact that the standards being upped. But I like the effort to balance that against other engineered projects. So that's a discussion goes along with the second.
Sarah Lee,
Discussion on the motion?
as long as I don't have to restate. Okay, I think the motion, I don't know if the motion actually was for Clay and Ben to write language was.
But it was very clear too that the language is for chapter 50. And
Should
I
I
think that's an
restate what I-
important,
Yeah,
Leave
Clay,
restate.
restate.
First and foremost, one, that staff will develop draft language for incorporating a floodplain management requirement into the Chapter 50 countywide minimum environmental standards. Second, in both that and in Chapter 72, we will be looking at establishing a threshold for the compensatory storage that is above 1:1 and looking at what would be a reasonable and most acceptable safety factor. And that we would be also developing some form of criteria for any kind of deviations or appeals that would be subject to those standards.
Thank you for reiterating the motion that was made by Tyler and seconded by Sarah.
Jack's
Seconded by Jack, sorry. Now we have discussion.
Is that accurate?
The only thing I wasn't suggesting higher than 1:1.
Yeah, I
I
understand.
think 1:1 compensatory storage is fine, but it's
But I
an
was.
opinion.
Okay, yeah. See, and that was why discussion, because I think in order to provide some guidance here, whatever the ultimate vote is on this motion is important. What I wanted to say was, I think it's important that there is a standard in chapter 50, and there is not. What I also think is important is that when a lot of noise gets created, what seems like an obvious decision becomes a difficult decision. And because there is nothing in chapter 50 right now, to me, what's most important is we get something on the books that everybody, there's no reason they can't comply with it. And for that reason, because I am concerned a little bit about adopting a standard of 1.5 to 1. And we don't have the science for that. We've said that. We like, or some of us like, that it's stronger, but we don't have a basis other than New Smyrna did it. And when I think about 16 jurisdictions, and that it's more important to me that there be a standard, I personally would back off the 1.5 just so that we can get something on the books that to me is important. I do think having some language that gives, I understand what Tyler's saying. It's unfortunate, but I know it to be a true statement. And I go back to thinking how important it is to me that there be a standard across the entire area.
One point of clarification. We're not talking about getting rid of standards per se. What I was addressing is that when you go into appeals, trying to establish within the appeal criteria, every situation is very difficult. I have no problem with us setting up exactly standards A through Z as far as what has to be on the plan. It's then up to the engineer of record of the applicant to sit there and go, I can't do B because of this, this, and this, and I'm proposing that. That's where I believe that we're looking at. And so it's being able to say, here are our minimum standards. If you want to deviate from those, you have to provide us with sufficient evidence that you've got sound engineering practices to be awarded that deviation. Just want to make sure everybody was aware of that.
Jameson, then Donna.
It works. Okay, so a little bit off of this, but we're talking about minimum standards. Clay, at the last meeting, right at the beginning of the meeting, you were informing us about Senate Bill 180. So we have that. And then there has also been a lot of discussion, and I don't remember which Senate bill it's in, 1730 something, about home rule. And so I was wondering about the conversation at home rule, and if that would affect this conversation about minimum standards.
I'm going to do what all smart staff does, and that's punt to Paolo Soria, who's our senior assistant county attorney. I believe he's online. Paolo, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Clay, as always. Okay, let's start with SB 180. We have been tracking that for the legislative session. It technically ends tomorrow, but there's discussions, some finger pointing, there's shenanigans going on in Tallahassee. So the House and the Senate are coming close to some sort of budget resolution. SB 180 has not been signed by any of the House or Senate officers, and it has not been sent to the governor for his consideration or execution or veto. Let me check real quick on 1730, but I do not believe that has also gone. So 1730 is the Live Local Act Part 3.
Hey, Paolo, will Senate Bill 180 prevent us from enacting any changes to the minimum environmental standards as part of the charter?
If
it's signed by the governor.
If they are more restrictive or burdensome, that would be yes. So as we said before, you know, your low impact development criteria, because they are voluntary and they are not a more restrictive or burdensome process, they're an optional process. Those are good. Those are clear to go. We can provide that option for LID. The Chapter 72 stormwater ordinance that the county passed in February, that would be rendered null and void by SB 180 because it's a more restrictive regulation. And I just checked, so SB 1730 is still enrolled. It has not been sent to the governor for his veto or signature.
Hey, Paolo, this is Ben again. If the changes to Chapter 72 match the federal standards for floodplain compensation in terms of 1-to-1, would that be considered a more restrictive or burdensome? Because that's already the federal standard. We'd just be codifying it in part of the environmental standards.
Potentially, yes, because it depends on whether or not it is a mandate for the federal standard and how those federal standards are enacted or enforced by a local government. My understanding is, for NFIP and participation in the CRS, the more you participate, the more points you get. It's not technically a mandatory thing. It's an incentive-based program. Create these types of regulations, you get more points. You have a lower CRS rating.
Thank you. Donna, Wendy, Bill, Jack.
I fall into Tyler's category of the ones who's lost here. Partially because it's been a while since I worked in municipal related issues. But what I'm trying to figure out is if we adopt this minimum standard, am I understanding this correctly? If we do a 1-to-1, then the municipalities themselves, it doesn't preempt them from adopting stricter, higher standards if they want to. So that addresses sort of the home rule question. And it sets a minimum standard for the county. The issue that I've had with the 1.5, or frankly anything else, is it defensible? And right now it doesn't sound like any standard we adopt is, because it hasn't been applied anywhere where it might work. And so that's why the 1-to-1 makes sense to me as a minimum standard, and then work up from there. Especially since New Smyrna has done something that can be evaluated at some, foreseeable point. But that's kind of where I am with all this, to the extent that I get it.
Wendy, Bill, Jack.
I was just going to respond to Bliss that we did decide last time that even in light of Senate Bill 180, even if the governor were to sign it or not sign it, but not veto it, it's my understanding that it goes into effect even if he does nothing with it. But he would have to actively veto it for it to go away. But anyway, we decided that we should proceed with our work, establishing these language proposals, so that when or if that that bill were to expire in October of 2027 or at some later date, we are ready to go. We have a package ready to send to council and consider it. And given how slowly we work as it is, October 2027 will be here before we know it, just like we continued our work when we were constrained by Senate Bill 250, and then it went away before we thought it was. But even still, we didn't really get stuff before the council, before fall of 2024 anyway. So, the timeline doesn't concern me. We should just proceed with our work.
Jack.
The Senate Bill 180 is also retroactive, right? Does that mean that it would negate what New Smyrna has done here?
Depends on when they did it. If New Smyrna's codes predate August 1st, 2024, they're safe. So it's retroactive to August 1st, 2024.
So does that mean you would know? It's negated, or it predates it? Okay.
I don't know. I don't know when New Smyrna's which amendment that New Smyrna has done to their flood hazard management and when that happened. But that's the threshold is was this enacted or effective before or after August 1st, 2024 is the retroactive effect of SB 180.
Bliss.
Yes, okay, so I was referencing, Senate Bill 180 because that's what we started with. But since that meeting, I've been at other meetings where they are talking about home rule being pulled back, restricted at the state level. And different municipalities are writing letters and that sort of thing. And I can't recall if it is 1733, 1738, but it is out there. So, and it was about home rule, and it was separate from Senate Bill 180.
Home rule is a favorite target of the legislature. A lot of the bills that we were tracking and that we were opposed to had to do with the deterioration of home rule. So, as an example, HB 1730, that's the Live Local Act. That is, in effect, taking away home rule, which is the ability for a local government to craft its own laws or decide for itself, what is the best way to handle any subject. So, under 1730, that's just an expansion of the preemption aspects of the Live Local Act. So, it's clarifying regardless of, in a zoning area that is industrial, commercial, or mixed use, you have to allow a multifamily development so long as 40% is quote unquote affordable for a period of 30 years. And they can use the highest density in your jurisdiction and the tallest structure within 1 mile and, the highest FAR. So that's the type of deterioration of home rule concerns that we have. There's nothing particular about flood hazard management or stormwater regarding that, because the Live Local Act targets 4 aspects: density, use, height, floor area ratio, and parking if you're so lucky. So, those are the aspects of home rule that is being taken away. But it's local governments are a nice target for the legislature in Tallahassee, and they are always taking away aspects of home rule.
Thank you, Paolo. Bill, then Jack.
I like the idea of just what Tyler suggested, just give it to you guys, come back with some good language. It's a very complicated issue, and for us to debate it right now, it's really not fair. So I would suggest that.
Jack?
I'm with you. Our discussion has gone beyond the motion. and
I
so
was
we
going to
just go ahead-
remind everyone, we do have a motion.
We need to go ahead and vote on this thing. Yeah.
Okay. So the motion was made originally by Tyler and then stated clearly by Clay and then seconded by Jack Surratt. We've discussed it. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
No opposition. I didn't hear any. Jessica, did you say aye or no?
In favor.
That's what I understood you to say. Thank you. Motion carries unanimously.
Okay, so that was to the chapter 50 edition, right? I do want clarification from the committee if we want the 1-to-1 for compensating storage and additional language within chapter 72, right? They just wanted to make sure we're very clear. We're not doing a 1-to-5 or however, just a clear motion on that one.
I would think that it would be desirable to have chapter 72 be consistent with chapter 50. But we need a separate action for this to vote on it. Would someone like to make a motion that we have consistency? Thank you, Donna. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Tyler. So all those in, any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, let's move on to something newer. Oh, just kidding. So last time, you requested additional information about the potential modification to require hazardous materials to be stored above the base flood elevation for commercial properties. You had a lengthy discussion about it last time. And the additional information we came back with for you is that we have 263 properties zoned industrial or commercial with buildings within the special flood hazard area within unincorporated Volusia. And then ones that we actually have site inspections for hazardous material generators. There's 8 of those sites. So potential impact 263 if they were to change their industrial or commercial use on the property, right? But known hazardous material generators within unincorporated in the special flood hazard area at this moment is 8.
So one of the things we were concerned about, I recall, was the ability to actually enforce or inspect. Yes? Okay. So you can say with certainty that of the maximum universe of 263, it is known for sure that 8 and no more than 8 are hazardous waste generators.
This is from the list of properties that are pollution control activity and specs. And that is based off of the information that was previously provided by the business tax receipts, which we no longer have. So the number could be a little different, right? Based off of the known knowledge of the new businesses. So this is the best information that we have to make it more confusing.
So if ENRAC had to go out and inspect every single business, we'd be going out to 263 businesses.
Yes, because we know that we have properties with buildings in special flood hazard area.
Thank you. Clay.
Just a quick clarification. We have obligations under the small quantity generator inspection process anyway. We have 2 people that are assigned to do so. And by state law, we have to do a minimum of 25% of all registered businesses that we know. Even though we may not have business tax receipts, we still have the state information in regards to businesses that are operating in Volusia County. So even though the business tax receipt information was quicker, easier, and better for us, we still have a reliable resource in the state to help us longer term. So we are able to do so. We've exceeded our minimum requirements on an annual basis consistently, at least I'm aware of at least 10 to 12 years now. So we are actively going out with our 2 folks and inspecting all of the businesses that are identified. So we do have a good, and I would say robust inspection process for those.
Yeah, thank you, Clay. I completely forgot that the way that we generated this information was that pollution control downloaded the data from FDEP from the state, and that's what we use to synthesize to get to this number.
Thank you, both of you. Bill.
I'm sure we sent you back with that task to get that information, but help remind me why is there a vote that was pending on that?
There was a vote pending because you weren't sure how much of an impact adding this requirement to the code would have. And so this would show you that these are the properties you would impact. We also discussed having outreach and education for the commercial industrial properties, things of that sort through our program for public information, which we do through the CRS program.
Well,
Was that a motion on the floor, but we decided not to vote on it because we wanted the information?
I don't remember, but I don't think it made it to motion. I think someone would have to move now.
And I have
Bliss.
just a question.
Yes. And then
And sorry,
Bliss.
I don't know the best way to tell you guys that I have a question. Apologies. I think we were also going to ask about if there are any non-conforming uses, if there was a phasing schedule, like that we've seen in others that might be applicable here. Was there anything we found there?
To be honest, I did not research that, Jessica.
Okay, no worries.
Again, the chair is unable to make a motion. Tyler.
I don't know that I have a motion here. Sorry. I just have more questions. So you said there's 2 full-time people that their job is to go inspect businesses that could have hazardous materials, or is it all businesses that they're going to? That was Clay that said it. And he's occupied right now. Yeah.
I think that's for Clay.
Yeah. I'll wait till Clay's available. Yeah. No. What are the businesses that the inspectors are currently going out?
Okay, there's the state of Florida has broken it down such that DEP does certain permitting and inspections, and local governments carry that function out for small quantity generators, SQG. So those are businesses that have been identified based on the type of business and the materials that they utilize are targeted for these types of inspections. So it's the known people,
It'd be like the 8 that are on this list of 263 that are hazardous material generators then.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now we don't have staff that have time that are they're twiddling their thumbs to go inspect
Oh, no, we-
260.
We are out there every day doing the inspections. So we have, I mean, we have the more than sufficient staff right now because we're exceeding the minimum requirement from the state. The state requires that we cover at least 25% of the businesses on an annual basis. We're hitting somewhere between 40 and 60% every year. So we are able to get out there, I would say, every other year to make sure all of the small quantity generators are in compliance with the requirements.
And I want to definitely point out that these are numbers for unincorporated Volusia. Staff is inspecting everything for the entire boundary of
Okay.
Volusia County.
So inclusive
Yeah,
of,
it's not just 8 properties that they're looking
I mean,
at.
I guess the question I'm asking, and I don't really need to be the one to assess to make the judgment, is can we absorb 250 additional inspections a year? If we create a rule, is there a way for staff without additional resources
sorry.
to actually, manage the additional inspections, or do we need to hire somebody?
If all 263 became that way, yes, we would have a staffing issue. Yes.
And so that's kind of the question I have is what's the enforcement side of this look like if we have the rule? I don't think that this isn't thousands. That's what my concern last time was, is this hundreds or thousands? I think that this is a reasonable number that we could move forward with something on. I just don't want to create a problem that has an unintended expense that then council is like, why are they recommending this stupidity?
Bill, then Michelle.
And refresh my memory about underground storage tanks. Were they exempted or something?
I believe the discussion
Gas stations
They
are
were
a separate
completely
entity.
different. And
Yeah.
That's a different animal.
So so the
Yeah,
state
Paula
law,
talked about last time.
376, 317 is a big state preemption for local government ordinances that impact fuel, like underground petroleum storage tanks. So you can do an ordinance. Actually, no, you can't, because it needed to be in effect before September 1st, 1984. So the petroleum industry has, as we all suspected, protected itself in terms of their underground storage tanks.
And we did discuss that last time. Yep.
Michelle, then Tyler.
Just a quick clarification, but aren't they already out there doing the inspections? So why would we be adding additional inspections? County. Okay, I just wasn't clear on them.
Yeah, so that 263 would be the maximum amount if every single commercial and industrial property in unincorporated Volusia was a hazardous material generator.
Because of CRS credits. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, 10 out of time.
I wasn't glaring at you. Tyler, you still, oh, sorry. I thought you were.
I was going to make a motion now so that we can get the thing.
Please.
forward. So I'd like to move that we approve the requirement for hazardous material to be stored above the base flood of elevation for commercial properties. I think that we need to have a minimum 6-month grandfathering period included from the date that the rule becomes effective to the date that businesses have to comply. And I think that it's self-certification with your annual. Do we still have a business tax process, even though we
No.
I mean, I have to have a business license with the city. I have to have a license with the state. There's got to be somewhere the
Nope.
yeah.
Nope.
Self-certification process. I mean, ultimately, I don't think we need to have inspections that are cyclical. It is what I'm trying to go to, that this is regulatory enforcement. And maybe when the fire inspection happens every year, it's something that the fire department can be looking at as a
True.
favor almost. But I don't know how to exactly word that part, but not something that we are staffing inspections to enforce, that this is reactive and honor system based.
I heard some clear brush strokes in there. I heard the requirement. I heard grandfathering minimum time of 6 months to come into compliance. And And I heard self-certification.
Mhm.
I second.
Any further discussion? I'm sorry. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Okay. Are we time for? No, we're gonna keep going. Okay. Got it. So now to new stuff. Okay. So the first three, the ABC, are going to hopefully be the easy ones. And then you're gonna probably have a large discussion about that last one. The first item, this would be for chapter 22 within our code, which is the technical requirements of the Florida Building Code, those specific requirements for structures within the floodplain, right? So one thing that the Florida Department of Emergency Management, they have the Office of Floodplain Management that we discussed, they have guidance that comes out periodically, and one of them is to update it into plain language. So essentially that's just changing this portion of the code to be easily readable by the general public and understand the differences between what's in the Florida Building Code now and then what we have changed as a local government, right? What we've done that's above and beyond the minimum standards of the Florida Building Code. So it's literally just a formatting change. That's all it is. And I can show you an example from the OFM guidance if you want to take a look at it, but just formatting.
Before we go further, will we be voting on A through D individually?
Probably a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
So would you like to see an example of that, or was my explanation sufficient?
I offer to be the dumb kid in the back and see if I can understand it. Because I am the dumb kid in the back.
Let me get there real quick.
We don't think it's simple.
Then you can tell me to make it more simple and I'll work with FDM to work on that.
Contact Rebecca Quinn.
Okay, so don't look at this highlighted thing down there. Right now our code looks like this. You see, okay, besides the highlight, right? We see this section, you know, it's just all merged together. It has the specific language within the Florida Building Code plus whatever we've amended. It's just all one thing. You can't separate like what's the difference between what the building code says and what is our more restrictive requirement. Bigger, okay. All right, so it's just all clumped together, right? That's how it is now in our code, which is typically how codes are. But then this is how it would look like. You would have, hey, this section in the Florida Building Code, then plus these additional things. Don't look at the red, just this whole portion. So it's saying, look at the building code here, and this is what we additionally require. So plain language, the language is more plain. I'm not saying don't look at this specific language, just how it's. Oh, yeah, no, yeah. This is an old document that was going back and forth. As you can see, there's comments from 2024. There's some from 2021. This is really old, but that gives you a general idea of what the formatting change would be. The intent of the original code that we have in chapter 22 was that it was supposed to be underlined and bolded for the differences between the Florida Building Code and our code. But the way that Muni Code does their formatting, they don't do that. So it all just looks like one big document.
Bill.
Hey, if we're gonna vote on these each, I'll make a motion to accept the change to simplify the language.
Do we have oh, I'm sorry. I see that John Geronimo had something to say.
Yeah, I just have a question, I guess, of Clay. It says market value of the structure. Structures have no market value. It's the building on the property. It's the house next door to me is valued at $900,000. The structure is valued at $200,000.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, is he restricted to $100,000 worth of improvements or $450,000 worth of improvements?
It's based on the valuation of the structures, based on the property appraisers tables, or an independent appraisal from a property appraiser. And it exempts out accessory structures and exempts out land value.
So the close to $1 million house next door to me can only do $100,000 worth of improvements.
The way it's, the idea is substantial improvement is that if I have a home that's valued at $200,000, but my property is worth $50,000 and I have a pool which is worth $50,000. So my net value of my land, my accessory structures, and my home is $300,000. I cannot use 50% of $300,000. I have to use 50% of the $200,000 structure to determine whether or not it's substantial improvement. And it's over a rolling 5-year period. So that means if I come in to last year and do $50,000 worth of improvements, then all of a sudden a storm comes and impacts me, and I have to do now an additional $75,000. Taking that 50 and that 75, I've now exceeded 50% of the value of my $200,000.
So the answer is he's only allowed $100,000 worth of improvements.
Yes, sir.
I do think, you know, on properties on the beach, there's no value in the buildings. It's all in the land. You know, the land is, if you have a waterfront home, the land is worth $1 million, $1.5 million. The house is worth 400,000, 500,000. Right?
Again.
Yeah, I mean, but that's whether that's an unintended consequence, you know, of this the way it's written. But what you've done with is properties, older properties, in Bethune Beach, for example, because many of them were built in the 60s, can't improve. They can't improve. They either have to tear them down and start something else. And I'm not sure that's what we want.
I want to get very clear to what we heard distinctly from FEMA after Nicole came through. If you have slab on grade and you should have piling construction, we want you to replace it. And that's the simple fact that FEMA came through, is that using frangible construction along the coast makes sense, as opposed to allowing for a home that was built prior to these standards being put in place to continue to draw upon flood insurance that everybody's paying for. So it is very distinctly focusing on making it so that these, so I just want to make sure everybody,
Yeah.
and again, these are coming from FEMA as we are working through a lot of this. And I am also going to ask Paolo to kind of elaborate on what kind of changes were identified statutorily by this year's legislative session.
So our friend SB 180 has a little known or not highlighted section to it. So the bill is generally about emergencies, and it actually touches on reconstruction of properties within the floodplain areas. And basically they are saying when you do your substantial improvement analysis, you cannot do a cumulative substantial improvement. So they're basically saying you cannot apply the rolling 5-year provision for applying this criteria. So you know, you're still prohibited from well, no, if you do a substantial improvement, you still need to, you know, completely comply with coastal construction standards. It's just we can no longer look back 5 years for, you know, and tally up all those improvements at once.
Yes, it goes back to the minimum
maybe-
NFIP requirement of the 50% for that event. And then our code has the 5-year rolling period, which is above and beyond the minimum requirements of the NFIP, which gets us CRS points.
This is really important information to have, but I'd like to remind us that Bill Lights made a motion to accept point A above, and we were pending a second. Thank you. Motion made by Bill, seconded by Jack. Any further discussion about A, plain language per FDEM OFM guidance? All right, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay. Next one, this is already done within our with building staff right now, but we just wanted to codify it so that it is it gives us CRS points if we have this in the code. Same thing for the next one. So it's to require all dwelling foundations within zones A or AE to be designed by a registered design professional. Pretty straightforward.
Jack?
What is a registered design professional?
Typically, there would be an engineer.
Excuse me?
Architects and engineers.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct. And I triple confirmed right before this meeting that we do.
So this would be to simply codify something that we are doing anyway. And Wendy?
Just a quick question about the conversation we had earlier about SB 180. So here we are trying to just sort of update our language based on federal standards and current practice. Does that count as having more restrictive requirements, more restrictive codes? Like, can the state prevent us from updating our language to federal standards?
So the issue with the NFIP and participation is it's not a mandatory participation event, right? It's do these things and you get points. So some local governments have been kicked out of the CRS program. Some don't have as many points as Volusia County. So that's the issue, is that it is a government program, but it incentivizes communities to draft their ordinances and practices to kind of best mitigate flood hazard.
So the communities are incentivized, but it isn't an incentive for a developer. So it doesn't, so are you saying that under 180, we would be able to update to these?
No, if it's more restrictive than what our current practice, I think that SB 180 would actually prevent that. Now, if it's something that's we are absolutely complying with the way that the federal law works, the supremacy clause kicks in, then we'd have to comply. But because of the nature of the NFIP program and the CRS, these are all kind of incentive-based ordinance provisions. We're not required to comply with it, but if we do, we get points.
Got it.
Bill?
Well, we're just moving forward anyways, right? Yeah.
Okay, so we were awaiting a motion on B, potentially. Yeah,
Make a motion.
well, we agreed, we said we were taking them separately, so.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make the motion for a B. Thought I did. I'll make a motion for B as written to require all dwelling foundations in zone A, E to be designed by a registered design professional, architect or engineer.
Yeah, let those get you to say.
So I'm looking at, yeah, I got it. I'm looking at the CRS checklist right now. And it looks like the item that we could get credit for from the CRS checklist is having the flood elevation defined for zone A by a professional engineer. Is that what the intent of this is?
I don't know what exactly you're looking at right now because I
I'm
don't.
looking at item B that says require all dwelling foundations in zone A, AE to be designed by a registered design professional. I'm trying to match it to the checklist here.
The
And-
checklist in the CRS manual?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to pull the whole manual out and
Well,
get that for you.
Okay, so these are being listed as potential modifications. My understanding was that this was to get a CRS point.
Yes,
and
it
I'm
is-
trying to better
it is one
map
of them.
it to, and so that's, I thought we already had to have signed and sealed foundations.
You do by policy. It's just not in our code. So we're just putting it in the code so that we would
I
get
mean,
CRS.
Building
points.
code requires a signed and sealed foundation design. Like, I mean, that it is in our code, absolutely 100%. You have to have a signed and sealed foundation design. So I'm trying to figure out what we're actually trying to require with this and make sure that we get it required if that's what we're moving forward with. That's the conversation I'm trying to have. I'm sorry if I'm being confusing.
I think they're trying to put it in the county code
Okay.
and codify it.
Clarifying, yes, you're 100% when you're correct. When we are looking at plans for a new home, it has to be signed and sealed by the appropriate design professional, architect, or engineer. One of the things that is in chapter 22 of our code of ordinances, which is an adoption of the state's Florida building code, we also have a local ordinance aspect where we basically go back and, for lack of a better term, reiterate some of the requirements out of the code, out of the Florida building code into our local code. So if you go to chapter 22, buildings and building regulations, that's where you see the local supplement to the Florida Building Code Administration. That's what we're trying to do so that that way we can tie in our compliance with the Florida Building Code, which is automatic, to also being able to meet the FEMA requirements so we get the CRS points that we need.
Okay, so if you're wanting to know the exact CRS, it is 432C FDN1A.
You sank my battleship.
Yeah, this is directly from the CRS manual. I just made a spreadsheet for myself to make my life easier.
Okay, so we had a motion to accept B. We had a second by the architect, John Geronimo. And we have had some discussion. Any more discussion, or may we proceed to a vote? We may proceed to a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any, Jessica, did you aye in there or nay in there? Any opposed?
Nope.
Pardon?
Sorry, I was in favor. I was muted.
Thank you. It sounded like a hiccup. Okay, one abstention. All right. Motion carries. Thank you. C.
Seems to me like the goal was to have the flood elevation determined by a professional engineer, which is not what that says.
The FDN1, specifically as written in the CRS manual, is that you get points, which you can get prorated points if it's a little bit different, but must be constructed on foundations that are designed and sealed by registered design professional as complying with the requirements of the International Building Code, local building codes, ASCE 24, and other things. So that's what we're,
But if we adopt the Florida Building Code, why do we have to adopt it again in our own code? I'm confused why adopting. They don't give you the points when you adopt the overall building code. That's insane. At least my confusion was based on that.
Okay. It's 2:28, which is, we generally take a short break at the halfway point. So I'm suggesting that we do that before we move on to C, and that we try to be back no later than 10 minutes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, friends. Good afternoon. Samantha's urgently anxious to get to item C. We're reconvening, please. Thank you. Thank you for this gavel.
Okay, moving on to item C. This is something that is already required because we are in the National Flood Insurance Program as a county, but it is not in our code. So that C is to codify the requirement for submission of the FEMA flood elevation certificate and the FEMA dry flood proofing certificate. Just putting the language into the chapter 22 of our code.
And we would be right in saying this is the same situation we just voted on with B, yes?
That is correct.
Okay.
I move we vote for this.
Seconded by the
Thank you, Tyler.
architect, John Geronimo.
Grazie mille.
Motion made by Tyler Malberg. Any discussion? All those in favor? Jessica?
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? I was going to start doing a Ferris Bueller one-off. Motion carries.
All right, moving on to the bigger question here. So item D is to modify the freeboard requirement to a higher standard of 2 feet for certain areas. Right now, the Florida Building Code requires 1 foot of freeboard. I don't know. Oh, freeboard.
Pull myself. Go on.
Okay, so where this came from, right? I'm gonna give you a little background. So back in September of 2024, HUD put a new requirement in for mortgages that are backed by FHA insured projects. They had to have a minimum 2 feet of freeboard for those types of homes. Now, there was a temporary partial waiver that was submitted earlier this year in February that waives that 2 foot of freeboard requirement. So HUD was going to require it for any FHA-backed mortgages. There is now a waiver to that. The plan was that we were going to just have our code be the same as the HUD requirement, which would kind of make sense, maybe. However, since that has been waived, I still wanted to bring it before you today for a conversation to see if you would like to potentially modify it to a higher standard, but maybe not for everywhere within the unincorporated areas in the special flood hazard area, but potentially for those that are going to be affected by storm surge, that are currently affected by storm surge, or storm surge plus sea level rise for 2040, 2060, 2070, or things of that sort. So I wanted to show you, this is from our vulnerability assessment that was approved by DEP. This is current day storm surge, and it shows the category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 storms. Category what? Hurricane. Oh. Okay. All right. So you see the impact on the county. So this could be a potential, if the committee wants to go this way, of an area you would designate that would have that higher standard for freeboard for the individual structures. And that is just current day storm surge right now. And then there's potentials if you wanted to do sea level rise plus storm surge for future projections. That was 2040. And there's different sea level rise curves that we talked about before. So a lot of different options of what you could do if the committee sees fit to do anything like that. So I want to just keep the base map, current day storm surge up, and open it up for discussion.
And Bill was first and then Ben, but
So can you help me understand that freeboard, is that the finished floor elevation that goes onto either an individual site plan? They have to be a certain finished floor above the road or something like that? And for developments, that the finished floor has to be certain,
It's above base flood elevation. So therefore, if you have a property where we know that the base flood elevation is at elevation 7, that under the current building code, that has to be a minimum 1 foot above that. So that would have to be at 8. Well, if this is, if y'all feel that this is appropriate to go forward with it, we would just require an additional foot. This is similar to what Broward County is doing right now in certain areas as well.
So one thing I would, although there was I guess the feds no longer require that, or is this the waiver? What was the language on they postponed it in it being enacted, or?
So it's a temporary partial waiver of that requirement and a few other things within it. And it doesn't really have an expiration date.
What I will say is anything reconstructed as part of Transform 386 funding, because that is HUD funding, that has not changed. So they still, anything that is constructed using that money today, regardless of the waiver Sam mentioned, still has to be constructed 2 feet above the base flood elevation.
Jack.
Are these certain areas, the ones you're pointing out here?
That's just what I'm proposing, but there could be other areas that the committee feels that would be more relevant for.
Like what? I'm not sure I understand.
Anywhere, maybe along the St. Johns River, areas that have been impacted by flooding continuously, or repetitive loss areas, things of that sort.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. That's actually what I was going to ask. Like, why are we focusing only in the coastal areas with storm surge? Why aren't we looking at the river and all of our repetitive loss areas? Because it seems like we would want this standard any place that's going to have serious flooding issues.
And I don't mean to monkey it up, but for instance, I live on the coast, 5 houses in, and the elevation of the road over the ocean is 13 feet now.
I don't think your property is within the special flood hazard area though, is it? No, and that's what we could do. It could be in the special flood hazard area, right? Because that's what Division 7 is all about. Plus, if they're in this, so we would overlay those two, and that would have that 2 feet of freeboard.
I think that the map is just kind of confusing me a bit because we have repetitive flood areas in the county, and I'm not seeing those on this map, but I get your point. I get your point.
You can also, this is Paulo, you can also use the coastal high hazard area. Those are tied to the slosh maps. So not necessarily purely coastal, but anything where there's, some danger of some body of water rising up.
So, Clay.
We're not asking you to identify all of that today. What we're doing is planting the seed, saying, do you want us to continue to look at what would be appropriate areas? Because right now, just opening it up, as you can see, y'all are like, what areas?
Yeah.
So I guess the first and foremost, is the group amenable to us coming in with an additional foot of freeboard for areas that may include this flood hazard or the flood zone, the 100-year flood zone, those areas impacted by storm surge, those areas that are tied to repetitive loss and similar other properties. And what we can do is then come back with a map that helps clarify the areas that we're talking about and give you all a geographic setting of where we're talking.
Thank you. Bill, and then John, and then Tyler.
and then we can debate it then, pull stuff out or add stuff. Okay.
So I guess I'm trying to gather, the science behind it or whatever too. You got it with HUD and you don't with FEMA. What's the advantage between 1 and 2 foot on the board?
The situation is this. For protection of the interior of the structure and minimizing damage to people's personal property within the structure. That's at the heart of all of the standards that FEMA puts in their flood insurance. If your property floods, they don't care about that. The minute that it gets into your house, that's when FEMA cares. And so the whole point is that if you can identify that there's unique circumstances or something different that causes you to need to be more than a foot above the base flood elevation, then you should be doing so. And that's at the heart of what the directions we're getting.
And also, you know, we've just seen 2 storm events that exceeded the amount of rainfall in a lot of areas that the 100-year floodplain is based on. So any additional elevation to these structures would reduce the amount of structures that get flooded.
Yeah, and adding on to that, we have repetitive loss properties throughout the county, as you all know, and some of those structures have been mitigated and elevated, but maybe just 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and they flooded again with the recent storms.
But I guess my question is 1 foot, 2 foot, should it be 3 foot, 4 foot? And I'm not suggesting that it be that because you have repetitive. I mean, we saw homes that were flooded to the roof repetitively. I mean, so what's the advantage of changing that when you have catastrophic flooding to begin with?
You're correct. If we have a 500-year storm event, all bets are off. If we're looking at a situation where, and I guess it's really geared more towards repetitive loss properties, which have substantial damage and have to be reconstructed. And I'll let Ben kind of talk about this. Our preference is if you're a repetitive loss, use some of the grant programs from FEMA and get out. Unfortunately, we cannot mandate that. So therefore, if you want to stay there, we need to be able to sit there and say, okay, you need a higher elevation. And perhaps it needs to be more site specific. It's harder to dictate that without going through and having a full on study tied to a 500-year storm event. But adding the additional foot again is kind of an easy way to catch all and hopefully elevate it to a significant amount. It doesn't mean it's going to stop all catastrophic flooding, but it's an attempt to minimize it. I guess the best way is to call it the bell curve. We hit 65%. We know that 17% of it is going to flood, 17% will be dry, and we'll have 65% somewhere in the middle.
Tyler?
So I'm thinking about this. I have some positive and negative thoughts in my mind, and the contradiction is making me not sure that I like the idea of this as a blanket. But so on the pro side, I definitely think there are some properties where this would be beneficial, especially our coastal influence properties where more storm surge or higher tailwater conditions are going to directly translate to higher flooding elevation. This makes sense. In our closed basin areas, so I think about West Volusia and the type of flooding we have here, a foot more rainfall if you're near the top of the basin does almost nothing to your change and experience. If you're in the middle, it could be 3 feet difference in flooding. If you're in the bottom, it could be your whole structure goes from a little bit of water to underwater. And I'm feeling like this doesn't do as much for those areas. Those are the repetitive loss items. And so then I was thinking about, okay, so what are the other places that we can touch grass on this? Daytona Park Estates. What does it look like when we have these houses that are already being built? Everybody's complaining they're too high, and we're going to make them be built a foot higher. Is that going to improve a circumstance there? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm inclined to say that it might just make the existing problem that we're having worse. And so that's kind of my question, really for staff is there somewhere that we don't want to make this apply because it's going to create problems for you guys?
You bring up a good point about Daytona Park Estates, and that's where if you use that as a multifaceted approach, so that not only do you can mandate a higher finished floor, you can also restrict fill, and you can basically mandate use of, say, stem wall construction or pier and piling, depending on the location of which is appropriate to minimize the fill brought onto the site. So it's one of many different tools that we could potentially use. But you're right. Everything has the potential of having unintended consequences. You're exactly right.
Wendy, Samantha, Bill.
Okay, so maybe maybe I just took what you just said and put it in the wrong chapter in my brain. But, I go back to our conversation about stormwater standards when we were going to increase the elevation of our sites. And I took issue with it because I'm like, wait, isn't part of the problem that we're building up too much? And yet everybody else in the room thought it was fine. So it went forward and now it's probably on hold anyway. So, um, but whatever. But that's the point. Like, are we talking right now only about reconstructing houses that have already had losses? Or are we talking about new construction? We're talking about new construction. All construction. So how does this then align with that stormwater rule that we sent forward back in February that requires an increase in elevation?
It doesn't really affect the stormwater rule, and the stormwater rule wouldn't apply to a single family home.
Okay.
So really where I see this gets sticky is it has a lot of value in applying to a single family vested lot residence. That there are places in the county where I think this is a good thing, but there's places where I think it could have more negative consequence than what the cost justifies. I don't know that the cost benefits there. I kind of liked the original discussion. I think Sam was trying to figure out how to delineate to our hazard areas or stuff that's more on the East Coast. Ben, with the flood studies, you guys aren't looking at more than 12 inches of rain, right? What we're doing in our closed basins.
Yeah, we are. We're actually modeling similar events to what we saw in Ian and Milton.
So I really feel like in the closed basins, the opportunity is going to be to tie to a higher flood stage standard rather than a higher finished floor difference. I'm inclined that we create multiple classes of rules that creates more questions of what our basis is, though. What's your guys' opinion? Do you like the 2-foot rule?
Especially on the rebuilds, it can be difficult. I mean, we've seen FEMA come in through the hazard mitigation program and elevate homes significantly higher than 2 feet. And the reality is for FEMA and for HUD, this was in response to HUD on FHA backed loans, is basically they're trying to protect their loan. And in FEMA's case, they're trying to reduce the amount of money they got to pay out. So by elevating these homes, and I think it's exactly what Clay said, it's a statistical analysis where you elevate it 2 feet. I mean, if you elevate it 5 feet, maybe you're getting 80% of the homes out, but 2 feet gets 65% of the homes out. And from a, amount of money that they're shelling out during these flood events for insurance claims and things like that, or in case of FHA loans, that they're protecting their investment. So that it's a pure money protection, investment protection standpoint. And flooding is not great. Flooding of your property is not great, but flooding of your house is catastrophic. And so from a standpoint of getting as many these, I mean, I see so many houses that are flooded that are below the road that were constructed prior to any of these rules. And if you just look at them and say, God, if they just built that road to today's standard or that house to today's standard, they wouldn't have flooded. Their yard might have flooded in the storm, but they wouldn't have flooded. And that water receded maybe 24 hours later. So personally, from what I've seen and been around the county during these events, I think elevating the homes where possible is a good thing. I understand that exactly what you point out, that not every lot is conducive to this kind of thing. And in regards to Daytona Park Estates, I think a lot of the elevating out there is in response to the septic system. And so there's ways to construct houses without dramatically increasing the amount of fill on these lots. It doesn't make it for a house that people may necessarily like with a garage they can pull into, or maybe it has steps that go up to the front door, which is not something you see in Florida or in this part of Florida a lot, but it definitely occurs in other parts of the country. But I think anything to get the houses out of the way, I think you can maybe provide for an exception, that's basically says if it renders a lot unbuildable, you could take a look at it. But That's what I would say.
So we had Samantha, then Bill. Thank you, Ben. So that was a yes.
So I just wanted to,
Channeling my inner Tyler.
I wanted to remind everyone that last time you did approve to require all new construction on vested lots within the floodplain, 1 acre or smaller in size, to use stem wall, deep footings, pier pile, unless compensating storage is provided. So we did have that. I just wanted to bring that up since Daytona Park Estates and everyone was speaking of that. That's it.
Okay, Clay had proposed, he can't make a motion, but he had proposed that we not get hung up about where and that they come back with language. I did get a little bit hung up when you said 1 foot instead of 2 feet, because what's up there is 2.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So the main thing is, do you want to have the discussion on increasing the minimum freeboard standard in the floodplain?
and someone could make that motion, right? Someone could make that motion.
Fine, I'll do it. I make the motion that we consider a higher standard of 2 feet, modifying free bird to a higher standard of 2 feet. And I would like to see the staff propose for us which areas make the most sense for that.
Do we have a second? Seconded by Bob Fitzsimmons. Any discussion? We will vote. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposition. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Okay. We are done with flood hazard management, at least the general, right? All right. So I think that before we get into wetland protection, you probably want to discuss what we're doing for July. So I'll let Melissa take it away.
Okay. We had a little sidebar at our break, and the idea of meeting in 3 weeks in June, the end of June, we need to take off the table. That's a little bit too soon. So we have some choices of later dates in July. If we were to do that, we would not have a quorum of our staff necessarily. We could not have a meeting in July, but this is the hardest working committee in Volusia County. I think we're all proud of that. And if we did decide to miss the July meeting, then I have further announcements to make. So so the last question is, we took a vote on, not a vote, we did a show of hands of quorum. So I just want to really quickly do that again, because I don't think Jessica was online when we did it. So first question is to Jessica online. Would you be able to make the July 2nd meeting?
Yes, on July 2nd, I could meet.
Okay, so that's a 1. Everybody else who had planned to make a July 2nd meeting? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, we would have a quorum in July.
I misread my calendar earlier. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's all right. We all make mistakes. Okay, so I would say then that our July meeting stands. Do we need to vote on that at all? No. Okay. How'd you like that? Done.
I will let Keith take it away.
Hope everybody got to look at their homework and familiarize themselves with the previous presentations. There were many. So next page. A little bit of a recap. We got quite a ways into the wetland code. We had started it kind of like the tree ordinance. We were going line by line, and we all realized how painful that was. So, this is what you've already voted to approve within the wetland code. Next page. Or do you guys want me to read them all, or are you good? Yeah. You want to go back to the no, you're good? Okay. All right, next. So this is where we left off at, some exemptions that we wanted to add or take away or modify, not take away. So the wetland code, we're talking about chapter 72. We're not talking about chapter 50. We'll get into chapter 50 later. But these are just some broad concepts. We're going to come up with some language, rewrite the ordinance and bring it back for your review. So broad concepts, you can vote on these individually. I would probably recommend that. And
So I went back through my notes and I thought at one point we had talked about right now, wetlands under a half acre are exempted.
yes, that is one of the
And
exemptions.
I don't see it on the list. And I'm feeling like the council has asked us to give a really thorough look to everything having to do with wetlands. So I just
If
like
it
to-
is the will of the committee to remove any exemptions, then we are more than willing.
So I just kind of would love to entertain adding that as something for us to discuss. Sarah Lee.
I feel like we have to have a discussion about it because what I heard council talking about was avoidance and minimization. We're all for it. So you have to at least have a conversation about the half acre or less.
I
Shelby.
wouldn't necessarily base it upon size, I would base it on quality of wetland. But
Pardon?
Bill I wouldn't base it on size, I would, on quality of wetland is where I would like to be based upon, because the size of it, you could have a 2-acre low quality wetland that's going to do nothing to the ecosystem, but if you have a half-acre high quality wetland, that's a different story.
And I think you and Bill, take it away, but I would just point out one thing. The super concern that the council has had has just been flood. That's what they've really focused on. I would sit here and make habitat arguments, but that's not necessarily they're very focused on the flood. Bill, and thank you for allowing me.
So just to be clear, it's wetlands that are isolated less than half an acre, not impacts that are less than half an acre to larger wetlands.
Correct. That is the exemption currently. Wetlands in total less than half an acre with no hydrologic connection.
Bliss.
No. We haven't gotten this far yet. Yes. Yes, then that will be, your
Tyler.
discussion.
I mean, it could be the last item on that page.
I mean, if you want to start with that now, then start with it.
Oh. Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm on the item that's not on the list here as well with the half acre. So my question, and this really is probably best answered by Bill, is what was the reason originally that, because I think this is a state DEP original carve out that got adopted locally. And I've heard a lot of anecdotal things related to biodiversity or basically the size of the wetland not being big enough to establish, hardiness or something else of the biodiversity, but it's always been things that are being repeated. Do you know why they excluded the half acre? Was it just a line in the sand?
I do not. And for the water management district, you still have to permit it. It's not actually exempt, but you don't have to provide mitigation for it. And if you have a big development where you are impacting, it all cumulatively adds up to more than a certain percentage, they will ask you to mitigate for it. So, but I do not know why.
And currently we can't have any buffers We don't have any buffers associated with those smaller wetlands. We can't require permits. We can't require avoidance minimization. We can't require mitigation. So there may be multiple half-acre wetlands within a development, and we treat them as they're not there. Like it's in the quality may be poor, but that doesn't diminish their capability to retain stormwater or provide some sort of habitat.
So this page talks about exemptions. We're asking to add one more exemption discussion here. Is there any other thing that would belong on a page of exemptions that's not there now for us to discuss? Okay, let's rock and roll. Oh, I'm sorry, John.
I'm confused. I've heard repeatedly that you can't build, we don't allow you to build in wetlands. You can't develop wetlands, right? What can you do in wetlands?
You can build in wetlands. We issue wetland alteration permits all the time. We have to allow for reasonable use of the property. So if you've got a half-acre lot and you're going to build a home on it, well, it's a vested lot. That's the reasonable use. You get to build a home on it, and you just have to get mitigation.
And just because you weren't here for round one, I learned the words avoidance, minimization, and mitigation.
No, I mean, I understand it, but, and it's just reading particularly the piece about stem walls and piers and that, oh, of course you can build in them. That's what you're allowing it. But we'll get back to that I'll get back to it later.
Okay. So we would like to reduce the width of the non-mechanical clearing of buffers from 25 feet in width to 10 feet in width. We feel that's plenty width to get walking trails, even ADA walkways, are typically 6 feet, and you got a couple feet on either side. 25 feet, we typically see people try to use that exemption to clear their buffer. And it's excessive. So they go in there with machetes, shears. They remove vegetation without a tractor or equipment. Chainsaw would typically be something they would use in that area, and it's for access to open water. So how wide of an access do you need for access to open water? Do you need a 25-foot wide access, or will 10?
Is this for like docks and things, or this is just so
Nope.
people can see out to the lake or the ocean or whatever body of water they have?
It says access to open water. So it's like you can walk out to the water. Docks, any permit that a dock would require a permit. So that wouldn't be an exemption. So you would permit your access for the dock, and any removal or fill or structure would be covered under your permit. This is just an exemption. Right now, you could go right to your buffer. You could clear, non-mechanically clear, remove vegetation within 25 feet. And in some lots, that's half the buffer or more.
So that's from me to you is 25 feet, and we want it to be from me to Donna.
John?
John?
Oh, okay. Tyler?
So I think, my question would be, would this also be for people that are trying to get access to their docks, or to, if somebody had a boat ramp on their property, something else that was permitted, would this be how they would be able to clear to get access?
No, that clearing would be permitted with that structure, whether it's a dock or boat ramp or some other structure, seawall, like that is all covered under your permit and would be covered under your mitigation.
It's spring and everything, all of my brush just exploded and grew out like 3 or 4 feet
Mhm.
from where it gets cut back to. And so I'm picturing that 10-foot opening getting choked off very narrow very quickly, and it being not really usable for much more than walking without a lot of maintenance. So
I don't think this would cover vista pruning, like we would typically, we would see, like you have low vegetation and then you have high vegetation and then you do some vista pruning to see the waterway. That's not non-mechanical clearing. That's more trimming or pruning. You're talking about they're taking all vegetation down to the ground level for access for walking to open water.
Bill?
And then can people put like a lawn chair out in this area to sit and look at their water? Is that why this is?
It says no fill. This is non-mechanical clearing with no fill. So what does no fill mean? I mean, yeah, a lot of people, they want to put pavers or fill. I don't think that would cover a chair sitting
Okay.
there. Fire pit, yeah, that's probably going to be considered fill. It's something permanent and they're going to add fire and soot and ashes to it. But, you know, someone leaves their lawn chair there. No, we're not coming by to pick on them.
And this is for the buffer or for the wetland itself?
Well, this is for the wetland and the buffer.
Gotcha.
So
Well, you could. Yeah, that's what we would be looking for a motion to say, hey, do this or don't do this.
we're
And then we would
approving
bring
the
back,
idea and they'll write the language.
we'll write all the language and bring back the complete ordinance and then you can go through it all.
I'll make the motion to direct staff to develop language about this, and then we can discuss it when they come back.
Just for clarification, I know you just explained it, but tell me again, non-mechanical. And like, so you could go in and underbrush with a machete, but as long as you leave the treetops. I'm confused on what.
Yeah, typically people take a lot, they'll leave the trees and they'll take all the other underbrush away. They'll take saw palmetto, they'll wax myrtle, they'll take everything, all the understory out. And it just opens up the buffer. You lose that habitat, you lose
That's allowed.
25 feet, maximum 500 square feet.
25 feet
Yep.
from what? We don't clarify from what.
It really doesn't. Well, it's for access to open water. So yeah, we would say surface water.
I'm still confused. You're defining 25 feet to 10 feet, whatever that is, from where?
No, the width of the path.
Yeah.
Water body, like a lake.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
For you to walk out there and
Okay.
enjoy your water body.
Well, currently it says for access to open water.
Just for the access. So we probably ought to clarify that for access through the wetland. That's what you're talking about, because right now it's just 25 to 10 is what you got.
Yeah, well, the ordinance, the exemption already states that it would be 25
Can you
feet,
do it on lakefront, the whole lakefront,
25 feet in width.
10 feet width, whatever we decide to go to? I mean, can you do that?
It would be
The whole property boundary along the
I
lake?
mean, like clear the shore.
500 square feet.
up to 500 square feet. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. For access to the water body. So from
That's
your
what I'm
house to the,
confused on. Doesn't specify where that,
It's perpendicular to the water body.
where does it say that?
No, it doesn't.
it doesn't.
It's just a general,
Sure.
just like we went through for the floodplain stuff, general idea. It doesn't have the specific language, but
Okay.
it does, it is pretty specific within the exemption in the code right now.
Okay.
Bill and Tyler.
So we often have projects where we have a wetland that's a conservation area behind houses and it just gets grown up because Florida is pyrogenic and it's supposed to actually burn very frequently. And a lot of the vines and the wax myrtle and all that kind of stuff grows up and we try to get management plans approved by the water management district to go in there and underbrush and open it up like it would have been had there been fire. And there's a lot of resistance from the regulatory agencies for managing property like it would have been back in the day. so that you can actually have a visual to your open water body. So this to me just seems like it's not only saying, no, you're not going to manage that land to what it would have normally been for good habitat, but you're also going to reduce it even more. So you got now a 10-foot wide buffer and the rest of it, it's just got to be wild and
Including the
unhealthy.
We're not saying you can't do that. You can come in, and we do this all the time with the wetland alteration permits. It's a permit fee, it has no mitigation. It's so we can monitor it. It's, restoration. We're not saying you can't do that. We're just saying that if you're going to come in and you're going to clear this area and you're going to restore it, we want to see a permit so we can track it, we can monitor it, we can make sure that the replantings and all the things that are coming back meet all those criteria. We have those permits all the time.
So as Bill said, I want to go from my house to enjoy my water body. Right now, I can get myself and 20 of my friends with our machetes and whack away everything 25 feet wide down to the water body.
Mm-hmm.
And we're saying,
Correct.
and we're talking about me and all my friends with our machetes, all my friends and I, we're just going to reduce that to 10 feet. Okay. Where I got a little bit lost was with what Bill just said, because you obviously would manage a property in a way that's ecologically responsible, clean things out nicely. But a lot of people don't do that. They would just want to go in and obliterate. But I'm not sure how that related to to this question, because I sympathize and understand the problem of not being able to clear out what should have burned last summer. Donna.
This may be out of left field, but something was just said that has made me wonder if this has to apply only to get from point A to point B, which is a water body. I have preserve on two sides of my property. And the rear part is not problematic, but the side part is or could be in a drought because it's only maybe 20 feet from the side of my house. So do I get to apply this to that?
Not under wetland regs.
Somebody else can pay for the burn scar.
No, you may be able to do that, but we're within wetland. Yeah.
If you stop turning it off. If you've got to have access to another portion of your property, that is something that we can take a look at, and it may require a permit. If it's not access to open water, it doesn't meet that exemption. But yeah, I mean, if you've got to put in a dock somewhere, you can get a permit to do these things. Yeah.
It's just an area between two properties. And there's a road on one side of it and the rest of the preserve is behind it. But my house is next to it and it's the only building that's next to it. So I'm just trying to figure out, we started looking at it because of the drought the last several months, which appears to be over. But it's a concern because we already had a fire in the woods behind us. And so I was just wondering, this doesn't indicate that you have to be on your way to something. And it does not necessarily connected to a water body. So that was what made me ask.
Yeah, this is just access to open water.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm just doing math in my head. We have a 25-foot minimum buffer on all wetlands. 500 square feet divided by 25 already limits us to 20 feet in width. If you're running a continuous width all the way through, assuming that there's some distance from the surface water to the edge of the wetland, that you may also be mechanically clearing of, say, 5 or 10 feet. Now you're at 30 feet or 35 feet. We're below 17 feet. I feel like this is just almost a waste of our time to discuss that the 500 square feet is the limiting thing here that comes into effect. If you have a 50-foot lot that is on water, that's the only time that you're really going to see like the proportional major impact. And what I'm understanding of this, where it could be cumulative if all of your neighbors and you are doing 500 square foot each.
And we see that all the time.
I mean, is that creating a major flooding problem for our community?
Well, it will cause erosion at the bank.
Right, I'm against this.
Bill,
So one thing, when I did listen to the recordings, I only got through the first 2 or 1.5, but I noticed there is a lot of this happens all the time. This is a huge problem, but I don't know that really, maybe tell us where it happens. And because I think a lot of these things are overblown and to get the change. So I'd probably be against it too.
Daytona Park Estates is an area in DeLand that it happens a lot. We've got a lot of the grass ponds and open water out there and smaller lots. Julie's actually does our compliance inspections and violations. We see it in Deltona area all the time. Little small ponds and on lots, smaller lots. It happens more often than you think. And they're clearing 25 feet in width sometimes, or 20 feet in width times 2. So what buffer do you have left?
And then this will apply to Deltona?
To the unincorporated areas, yeah. Off Mitnick Road,
Gotcha.
Osteen, it will apply to all the unincorporated areas.
I'm sorry, but I lost the plot. Had somebody made a motion on this? Thank
Wendy
you.
made a motion.
No, to discuss them. I think we're voting one by one. Yeah. On all of it or on just the first one? Okay, thank you, John, for that clarification. Yeah.
It was seconded, so
We can,
Mm,
oh,
can-
and then John had a question. That was discussion. We were in discussion. Okay. Vote. All those in favor of asking staff to come back with greater specificity on this for us to make a final determination. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? I heard 3 nays? 4. Okay. And 1, 2.
Bill, Donna, I think,
Who was the 4th? Tyler.
Okay.
Bill, and
Michelle.
Okay. But it still carries.
Pass. Okay.
It's 3:33. Do you think staff, you know us, do you think we can get through at least one more, the timber catwalks? And then I do have an announcement before we adjourn.
Sure. So our next exemption that we would like to eliminate is the timber catwalk exemption. So currently you can construct a timber catwalk through wetlands without a permit. What we see quite often is they meander a catwalk through and in the very end, they say, oh, I'm exempt. I don't need a permit for a timber catwalk. And you come back later and there's a dock and now they have a dock. So we're not saying you can't have a timber catwalk. You just need to get a permit to get to your timber catwalk.
Bill and Jack.
So this doesn't have anything to do with docks, but it's through wetlands. And right now you're exempt from putting a timber catwalk in a wetland
Yes, from permitting. Yeah.
up to certain square footage, or just you can put.
No, just it's not to exceed 6 feet in width and no terminal platform. So
Yeah, that was my question, really. What's a catwalk? And so a catwalk can be 6 feet wide. So it's essentially a dock without an end.
Yeah.
Right? So if you, So if you build a catwalk to the edge of the lake and you just didn't do anything there, but just stopped this, sounds like you'd have a dock.
But you wouldn't have it. We've had this argument before with people. Well, there's no terminal platform. It's a timber catwalk. So,
Well, but what I mean is it is a timber. I mean, it is a catwalk because you didn't put anything at the end.
yeah, but you come back 2 years later, there's always a dock.
Well,
There's always a timber. Yeah, there's always a terminal platform when you come back later.
if you don't come back later, you don't see that.
Mm,
The-
that's, yeah. If you don't look at things, you don't see them. That's right.
Say that could happen. Today.
Yeah.
So if we come to the ground and the dock takes off the ground, there's no terminal platform. There's your loophole.
Yeah, could it be at any height?
Typically it's supposed to be high enough to where you can get sunlight through and plants and vegetation can grow underneath it. Typically it's like 6 feet.
What if it
In
was
height.
real high? I mean, what if you did it tall? That'd be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be a zip line.
You go above the trees if you want to.
Okay, Bill has patiently had his, Tyler, Bill, Michelle.
So it sounds like this is in response to basically some compliance challenges. Are these mostly single family residences?
Yeah. Yeah. You don't really see a lot of timber catwalks in commercial.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking where somebody with a commercial business that would install it, it's most likely either as a feature to try to, that's like as a wildlife feature or as a safety feature. And so I don't know that I really have strong feelings on this other than maybe we restrict the scope to residential or something along those lines. If that's where the compliance issue is.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen it on a commercial piece of property.
Reason you want to remove this exemption is because people abuse it and then go ahead and make a dock out into the water. So you want to stop them from being able to have a timber catwalk to the edge of the water through the wetland or get it permitted.
Yeah. Come in and get your permit.
Michelle.
Currently, as it's regulated, how do they clear the timber construct the timber catwalks?
Well, right now they're supposed to weave in and out of the trees and not remove or clear to do so.
Right, and then, and are they going, is Melissa going out there with the machetes, in her 6 foot width of the dock, right? Like, right, so is it non-mechanical or, I mean, I guess they're just doing it anyways because they don't have to do a permit for it, right? It's not regulated at that point.
Well, I mean, they're not supposed to clear to do so, but typically, someone's like, well, I had to cut that cypress tree down because I couldn't make that turn. I've got to climb. I can't, I've got a wheelchair. I can't make this. I can't do that. They do it after the fact, they do it and then, their neighbor complains. And we come out and go, well, you weren't supposed to clear. You weren't supposed to cut that cypress tree down. You weren't supposed to do this. And I'm like, oh, well, I had to. I said, well, you were supposed to get a permit. Just kind of, it snowballs into a situation. And this is less frequent than the buffer thing that we just talked about. Usually timber catwalks are very expensive. It's a lot of wood and typically they're a long distance. The cheapest thing they could have done in that entire process is come in and get a permit for it. But it does happen. It's just less.
Clay.
Wait, I had one more comment.
Yeah.
What if, I guess the only other scenario I would think this would work or could maybe apply or maybe not, that's what I wanted clarity on, is in a public park. If you guys wanted to build a timber catwalk, you would be exempt from permitting within yourself?
Yes, technically. We're talking about chapter 72. The county doesn't have to follow chapter 72. We only have to follow chapter 50 in the comprehensive plan.
And I just want to clarify, they're still required to get building permits for structures that require a building permit. So what we're talking about is exemptions from the wetlands standards. Remember?
Correct.
So that's what we're focusing on. And what you have many times, as Keith has referenced, is someone has this area, they come out, they do this without knowing that they need to have permits for these things. So then we're dealing with a post-permitting situation. and they are exempt from wetlands. All we're asking them to, requesting is that it be added as part of the permitting to ensure that if there is any wetland impacts, that we can identify them.
Bill?
So they have to get a building permit to do this, but not a WAP. So they're exempt from the wetland alteration permit part, but they're still getting a building permit to do it.
Do they have to have a tree survey for that building permit?
Most of the time, they're tree exempt. They're single-family lots.
If there's an existing single family home that's occupied, it is exempt from our tree protection. If it is a vacant lot that's being built for a single family home and at the same time they're doing this, yes, they would have to identify any impacts of trees that they are taking out.
If they have to get, if the exemption goes away and they have to get a permit, do they then have to have a tree survey, or does the exemption still apply? I'm just looking for the extra cost.
What was?
So if we got rid of this exemption, the tree exemption would still be in place if it's on an existing house. And so they would not then be subject to tree survey. So they're still going to cut your cypress down.
Well, they still have to, if you have to come and get a permit, you have to avoid and minimize. So let's say you've got, really nice cypress here, and you've got some that are not so nice here. We can say, hey, avoid these, go here instead. We have some sort of mechanism. Or let's say it's through the mangroves. We say, well, there's fewer mangroves on this side of the property. Go through there. Right now, we wouldn't get a review on it. Yeah, if the lot's tree exempt, there is no tree survey.
Yeah, he's going to have to be doing this on field reviews, or your staff would be doing this on a field review basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my whole job is to make things easier for people to do legally. And we always look for exemptions to let them, do doesn't need to go through the extra governmental review and cost and application fees and whatever it is. So I probably would not be in favor of this if it's, how often, what are we're trying to solve that they then abuse this and end up putting a platform out in the water and end up with a pier or a dock that they're not supposed to have. And they point back to this and say, well, I was exempt. And you have to argue with them and say, well, you're exempt for the part that goes through the wetland, but not the part that goes in the wet water.
Yeah, that's one of the situations. The other is, that they clear something they weren't supposed to clear, and they say, well, I'm exempt because I can build a timber catwalk. And they're like, well, technically you went above and beyond your exemption. It's like, oh, I can build a doghouse without a permit, and you come there and it's 3,000 square foot doghouse.
Donna?
I think I'm seeing this the way Bill just explained, because in my mind, the catwalk isn't the issue. The extension of it is the issue. And so it seems unfortunate to me to disallow the catwalk because someone might abuse the privilege. I'm just not willing to do that.
I heard it just a little bit differently. I heard it that right now timber catwalks don't require a permit, so people build them, and some people abuse them by going out into the water body instead of stopping at the water body. And what I'm hearing staff say, based on what they've gone through, is that they would, if we required a permit, we'd have an opportunity to, one, make sure that they know where the catwalk is, that it ends at the water body's edge, and two, perhaps avoid minimize what any kind of impact would be on that wetland. I'm just trying to make sure I understood the two things. So we're not saying no catwalk. We're saying you'd have to get a permit for it.
This is meant to be for another question, just so you know.
Donna, please.
That's why I did this, because I didn't know how to distinguish it. I take your point, but I think that can be done through definitions. And that way we don't have to get rid of the exemption. We can just define what constitutes the end of a catwalk. And so that way we've defined what, at what point that homeowner has made it a dock. I just think a definition would solve the problem.
Wendy? Then Bill?
Well, assuming there's some delineation of the wetland, which there may not be if there's no permitting process. And wetlands by definition fluctuate, right? In their water elevation, you have wet season, dry season. Sometimes there's standing water, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there might be development nearby that causes that wetland to become a permanent lake. And so maybe when the catwalk was put in, it was dry or mostly dry most seasons. And then suddenly there's a permanent lake and now it looks like a dock. And so the people didn't intend to do that, but that's what it is now. So I'm just kind of throwing out a scenario where if it wasn't permitted before, all sorts of crazy things could happen. And if it's permitted, at least now it's registered, it's on the county's radar. Again, they can give good advice. You know, I understand consultants are also out there to give good advice too, but you know, I don't see that this is looking to prevent building of catwalks, but to just provide more guidance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, I think it's the difference between a catwalk and a dock are pretty minimal. You know, it's really the same thing. And if it becomes water, it's more of a dock. We're talking about the platform at the end of the dock or the catwalk. And I think we're trying to solve a problem that happens after the fact anyway. And there is a permit, right? The permit is there's a building permit. And so there is a building permit from the beginning, and that gives you the ability to make sure they do it right, at least to that point. Wetlands permit does the same thing, right? You know, you're not going to come back a different time to look at a wetlands permit in comparison to the building permit.
We're not going to get a review on the building permit. If it doesn't fall within our purview, we're not going to look at it.
You're not, but someone is.
No, not for
No
wetlands.
one
They're
looks
not.
at that.
Not for.
A catwalk is never looked at after it's built.
They're not going to look at it for wetland codes or wetland impacts. No.
Okay, so what would they look at it for?
Just to make sure that it's structurally built to the code.
Okay, and it doesn't have a platform added to it because they know exactly what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, then they're going to be looking at it to make sure it was built
Right.
to
So
plan.
even though it's not relative to the wetland codes, they know it does not have a platform which has created something outside of this catwalk exemption. So, you know, to me, generally, I'm kind of on board with this circumstance because I think we're trying to compensate for folks that are trying to get around it, especially at a later date. And I'm sorry that they are doing that. I think it's inappropriate, but it doesn't seem like we should work to remove the exemption and make it harder for folks to do catwalks because of the folks that build platforms at the end of what is close to a dock. That's my impression.
Maybe I need to kind of clarify the situation. This is not a preventive measure from us observing just this egregious code violation. What we're trying to do is put it on parity. Because if you're building a dock and you're coming in with an elevated catwalk that leads to your dock, you're not exempt from the wetlands. So why are you exempt for just a catwalk? So therefore, that's why we're asking you to say that a catwalk should be treated the same as a dock. That's really at the nuts and bolts of it. The extension out into the body of water is kind of a superfluous discussion here. The issue is, if I'm building a dock, I'm having an elevated catwalk, I'm impacting the wetlands, I have to get a wetland alteration permit. Why shouldn't we be treating that same thing to a catwalk which terminates at the water's edge? That's all we're asking for.
Thank you, Donna. And Bill, are you still up? And Wendy, are you still up? Okay, Donna, Bill, Tyler, Draft.
I think where I'm seeing it differently is that I'm relating this, and I realize that there's a certain amount of apples and oranges here, but there are catwalks that go out to the beach and they stop. They don't have to go into the water. The assumption here appears to be that any catwalk that's built is intended to go into the water to some extent. And I'm not sure that that's appropriate. I don't know if that's how it's always done.
The code
But-
says for direct access to open water.
I'm sorry,
So
say again?
The code says for direct access to open water
Okay, well,
for the
how,
catwalk.
how is access defined? That doesn't mean that it has to go into the water. I still associate it with going to the edge of whatever the water body is. And that's where I'm stuck on definitions, I guess, because I see the potential for a catwalk to stop short of going into the water and becoming a dock.
Just to clarify, like even with your discussion about the dune walkovers, the impact of a dune walkover has to be mitigated through DEP and through our beaches and dunes. So if that's the situation for a dune walkover, what if that dune walkover becomes a pier? It doesn't matter whether it's a pier or a dune walkover, the impact on the resource is the same. What we're saying is that right now, the method for me to get from point A to the edge of the water is going to impact a certain amount of wetlands. But right now it's exempt because it's deemed a catwalk because it stops at the edge of the water. Now, if I say I'm building a dock, same exact structure all the way to the edge of the water, but now it's added into the water, I do need to get a wetland permit. So what we're saying is treat the catwalk and the dock the same because they are traversing the same area and impacting the same amount of wetlands, but one is exempt because it stops before it goes into the body of water, whereas the other one is not exempt because it carries on into the body of water.
I think I said Bill, Tyler, Jack.
So, I kind of want to let somebody else go first. Just, yeah, go ahead.
Right, so I think there's a very simple definition. I actually like Donna's suggestion from earlier that a catwalk goes from land to land. I'm picturing a lot of different scenarios where there's not a problem with this building a catwalk from land to land. A dock has a lot of other implications for safety as well as habitat impact. Thinking about what the council's concerns are, their concerns about impacts to wetlands that could cause flooding or other largely adverse effects. As I understand it, a catwalk or a boardwalk or whatever we want to call the term here is going to be less damaging when used as your access method than an at-grade path that we're disturbing the ground and stabilizing the ground for folks to get there, which is why we require them in environmentally sensitive areas for trails, things of that nature as an alternative to an at-grade construction. So it seems to me that if I own a house, I don't own a house on water, so hypothetical for real, if I own a house on water and I'm wanting to build a way for my family to be able to get down to the water's edge and be able to launch canoes or something else safely, that right now I don't have to hire Bill. Right now I have to hire a carpenter, I have to get some basic plans drawn, get a building permit, I can build my project. If we get rid of this exemption, I have to hire Bill, I have to hire a surveyor. I'm starting to add a lot of upfront expenses, and unless I'm financing it, I know that adding thousands of dollars to the project cost for me on home projects often makes it not viable. I'm going to be against getting rid of the exemption. It doesn't seem to support the goals of the council, and it doesn't seem to make things better for the people. I do like the idea of adding a definition though, land to land, so that you're not, the terminal platform is something in the air. Like if you make them connect it to the ground, at least if they come do something later, it's flagrant.
Jack?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. It seems to me a lot of this comes down to, a catwalk being called a catwalk and not being called a dock. I mean, in many cases, I think these catwalks are docks. I mean, what I would consider a dock is what is making access to water, and that's what the definition is here. And yet, if it's going through a wetlands and maybe not accessing water, that's not. And so, perhaps in many cases, we should just be calling these catwalks docks and requiring the permit as they should be getting them. And then you're not dealing with a platform being added to the end of a catwalk, but in fact, building a dock.
We have 5 minutes. You've been waiting. Would you like to say something? No.
So, we are directed by council to look at the wetlands ordinances to make sure we don't have flooding and that we're protecting our natural resources. This kind of stuff, after having gone back and listened to the 1.5 things before, just looks really minor. And it's just another grab, I think, for additional review and additional expense and not really making a big difference. So I'm gonna, not only on this one, but for little things like this, you gave the presentation, or you guys gave the presentation about wetland impacts, and we had, 12 wetland acres of impacts over 2 years or whatever. And it's like, you guys are doing a great job. This kind of stuff, I don't think really promotes the increase in protection against flooding and the things that the council wants us to do. So I'm going to definitely vote no on this.
I want to say one thing real quick. That didn't include all the half-acre wetlands that got filled because that wasn't part of our permitting back then. But I think do we need to have you make a motion to put that on the presentation for the next meeting, or can we just add it for the discussion on the half? All right, we'll just add that. And then
I think we're going to have to conclude probably without voting on timber catwalks. I don't know, but I just want to mention I'm a little bit troubled by the inconsistency Clay brought up. If I build a boardwalk and it continues to a dock, I have to have a permit because it's going to go out into the water as it exists now. But if I stop at the water's edge, I don't need a permit. And that, why? The inconsistencies bug me, but I don't know. Bill.
Maybe coming back with definitions, because in the ordinance, it really would be good to see the whole thing. This is just, we don't know what we don't know. So maybe come back with the actual ordinance with your suggested language and some.
That's a little bit different than what you guys had directed us to before. You wanted broad concepts. You didn't want to go through exact language. You found that cumbersome, and then now you're like, oh, what do you want?
I'm going to add a little bit more insult to injury in that a dock has to have a dock contractor, and that dock contractor has to have longshoreman's insurance. And so therefore, if we call a catwalk a dock, you've now increased the cost because you can no longer just use a carpenter or yourself. You have to hire a dock contractor, and they have to have longshoreman's insurance. So that's why you see that what we've been able to do to try and minimize some of the building code impacts on some of these relatively simple structures. All we're saying here is that we don't want to make it more complicated for the property owner, but we do want to treat impacts consistently. If I'm impacting it for a dock, and I'm doing the same thing with a catwalk, but stopping it so I don't have to get the longshoreman to come and drive the piles and all that fun stuff. So again, if we understand where you're coming from, we'll do whatever you got. I just want to make sure you all understand that there is a discussion in regards to, it's not as simple as saying that catwalk's now a dock, because now you've altered the entire building code requirements that we face.
We have 1 minute, and we have John and we have Donna, and please, your indulgence for me to make an announcement.
Just real quick, while you're bringing stuff back for the committee, I'd like to know the severity and frequency of these types of occurrences? I mean, is this a big problem? Are we fighting over 3 violations a year, or are we? I mean,
Yeah.
let's see how big the problem is.
And I said this is a much smaller issue. It is. It does happen. It's infrequent. You know, I don't know that I can give you the numbers on catwalks. We don't really categorize them in that way. They're just wetland violations. We would have to. Oh, docks would be more. Yeah, we don't permit the catwalks, so I can't really tell you how many catwalks are built.
So the announcement I want to make is that we are going to lose someone who's been super helpful to us. We get one more bite at the Clay Irvin apple before he takes retirement effective August 1st. Yeah. And and I thought y'all would want to know that ahead of the July meeting for whatever reason. So that's the reason, John.
Let's hope he comes anyway. You know, he can be just someone that visits.
Put them on the committee.
We would love you on the committee. So I'll save words for later, but I thought people should know, just especially people who can't be here in July. Thank you so much for your guidance and your faithful service to us.